Looking at Pompeii, though, gives us the ability to look at Roman houses. And specifically, we're looking at a domus, or an upper middle class, upper middle class home. So this is not the villa of the emperor. In terms of general layout, what we see is public space at the front and increasingly private space as you move back into the home, built around these large open courtyards. Of course, they're in Italy, so you don't have polar vortexes and all of that. You can have a little more open layout. There are heat sources in many of these homes. They would have, in some cases, heating under the floor, although that was typically something done for the very, very wealthy. And they become very interesting places. At the front, number 5 there, I'm going to bring up my pen and use this. I've got another slide for this too. We have public areas. So this would be like living on State Street with a storefront beneath you. Although here, the storefront is at the front of the home. It would help pay for the home. You would rent this out to, say, a wine cellar or something along those lines. And then as you move back, we get into sort of formal areas of the house where I might meet with clients or important persons. Moving back, we get into dining areas, bedrooms, and the kitchen is usually at the back, especially the summer kitchen. You want it as far from the rest of the house as possible because you don't want that heat source in the summer. Here's another image of it. So they would be furnished. The pools are the only area open here in the front. That's very common, and that was there to collect rainwater because only the top 1% of the 1% would have running water in their homes. Everyone else goes and collects it from fountains that are going to be found throughout the city. If you go to Rome today, you see all these fountains. That's what they were there for water distribution. But the 1% would own a home. By the way, 99% of people lived in apartments of some form, so homes are not common in the ancient world. And then we have a series of rooms as we move back. So we've got sort of our parlor, moving back in this case to a study. And then we move back into sleeping rooms. There would be the family dining room would be back here, although oftentimes there's a formal dining area off of the atrium somewhere. In the back here, the second courtyard is often a garden. Sometimes this is much smaller, sometimes larger. This is where you would have your sculptures, but it gave sort of an outdoor element to the indoors. They are not going off and walking in the woods. The Romans are not as keen on the wilderness as we saw from the Etruscans or the Minoans. We have storerooms and everything else that you would generally expect. And it's built for the climate. This is the sort of place that only works in this area, in the Mediterranean, where generally things are going to be warm. You don't have to worry about, again, snow and cold and everything else. The kitchen, even in one of these upper middle class homes, would have been fairly simple by our standards. You would have a wood fire oven, sort of a stove setup on the top. You would have very simple materials, jugs for storing things, your usual pottery and everything else. The bedroom would be heavily decorated. You would see it covered in murals, as well as a shrine, which we see here, let me go back, to your domestic gods. Most of these rooms, other than the kitchen, are going to be decorated with murals. Very, very common in ancient Rome. It expands the space. It gives the impression that there's more there. Otherwise, they're looking at simple white walls, and this is the upper class. They don't really want to do that. The dining room would be set up with these banqueting couches, which we've come across in the past. They would have cushions on them. Here we see them without that cushion, so you can see the strapping underneath that would have held that cushion in place. In the center, there would have been a table. The floors are mosaic because this is considered a public space. And then the walls, again, muraled. And we'll get into the murals more later on. The atrium, this big public space, again, would be heavily muraled. It would be covered in mosaics. It would have been phenomenally decorated. This is where you would put all your expensive furniture and your expensive furnishings. And then you have that pool in the center again to collect water, because water that you can collect there can be used to water the garden, wash up, etc. They're taking it out to do these things. But it means that the servants don't have to go out, or the slaves don't have to go out and collect water quite as often. It adds to the efficiency. In some cases, they would have a larger cistern underneath that pool that they could drain into and access.